There's a kind of forgetting that doesn't feel like loss. It feels clean, like someone tidied up before you arrived. Everything in its place, every question answered, every mystery solved before you even thought to ask. You were told who built the pyramids, Fourth Dynasty pharaohs with unlimited slave labor and ingenious engineering. You saw the diagrams of ramps, the models of copper tools, the videos of workers hauling massive blocks with rope and determination. The story was complete, satisfying, logical. You nodded and moved on, but there's a problem with that story. Actually, there are many problems. The Sphinx shows water erosion from rains that stopped falling thousands of years before any pharaoh was born. The king who supposedly built the largest monument in human history never left a single word inside it. Workers transported millions of tons of stone but kept no record of what they were building. It's not just that something doesn't add up. It's that everything seems designed not to add up, like someone built a comfortable story on top of another story and buried the first one deep enough that you wouldn't think to dig. By the way, if this mystery already feels like something rarely discussed, hit subscribe. We're just getting started, and some questions have been waiting a very long time to be asked. Because this isn't really about pyramids, it's about memory and what it takes to make an entire civilization forget something it once knew. In 1858, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette was clearing sand from the base of the Sphinx when his team uncovered something that would quietly shatter everything Egyptologists thought they knew about the Giza Plateau. Mariette wasn't looking for revolutionary discoveries that day. He was conducting routine excavations as part of his broader survey of the site, methodically documenting the smaller artifacts and architectural fragments that typically surrounded major monuments. The limestone slab his workers unearthed was broken, weathered, and initially unremarkable. It wasn't gold or jeweled. It wasn't decorated with elaborate royal cartouches or artistic flourishes. It was simply a piece of carved stone covered in hieroglyphs that would need careful translation to reveal their meaning. But the moment the inscription was decoded, everything changed. The tablet, now called the inventory stela, contained a message that was clear enough to translate, official enough to be genuine, and disturbing enough to make the archaeological establishment deeply uncomfortable. According to this stone record, the Sphinx was not built by Khufu, the pharaoh usually credited with the Great Pyramid and the entire Giza complex. Instead, the inscription describes how Khufu found the Sphinx already buried in sand, how he organized its restoration, and how he built temples nearby in honor of its guardian power. The monument that every textbook calls Khufu's masterpiece was, according to this stone record, already ancient when he arrived to worship at its feet. The stela opens not with the usual pharaonic boasting about divine construction projects, but with something far more humble and far more troubling. A simple administrative list, an inventory of shrines and temples that Khufu supposedly built in honor of something that was already there, something he hadn't created. The tone is respectful, almost reverent, as if the pharaoh was approaching a sacred site that commanded his deference rather than his dominion. The text refers to Isis as mistress of the pyramid and mentions a temple that once stood next to the Sphinx, now lost to time and sand. But the most significant detail is what the inscription doesn't say. There's no mention of Khufu commissioning the Sphinx, no description of its construction, no claim of divine inspiration for its design. Instead, the language suggests restoration work, maintenance, the careful preservation of something that was already ancient and already sacred. This phrasing reveals something that makes modern Egyptologists profoundly uncomfortable. Even Khufu's own priesthood, the people responsible for crafting royal propaganda, and maintaining the divine mythology of pharaonic power, believed the Sphinx was part of an older, sacred landscape, one that predated their pharaoh, one that belonged to forces beyond his control, one he couldn't take credit for creating. To understand why this changes everything, you need to grasp the rigid logic of Egyptian kingship and the way pharaonic power was constructed and maintained. Pharaohs didn't just build monuments for practical or aesthetic purposes. They immortalized themselves through stone as part of an elaborate system of divine legitimacy that connected earthly rule to cosmic order. Every temple was named after its royal patron. Every statue was positioned according to sacred geometry that reflected the pharaoh's relationship to specific gods. Every structure had an owner, a date, a divine purpose that served as permanent proof of the ruler's connection to eternal forces. The pharaoh was not just a political leader but a living god, the earthly embodiment of divine will, the bridge between human society and celestial power. His monuments were not just buildings but theological statements, permanent declarations of his role in maintaining the cosmic balance that kept the universe functioning properly. To find a monument without a clear royal patron was not just historically puzzling, it was theologically impossible. So when you discover the oldest and most mysteriously positioned monument in Egypt, the one that sits at the exact celestial junction of sunrise and equinox, aligned with astronomical precision that rivals modern engineering, with no documented builder and no clear connection to any known pharaoh, you face a choice that threatens the entire foundation of Egyptian chronology. Either admit that something fundamental doesn't fit with the established timeline or find a way to erase the question entirely. The archaeological establishment chose erasure, and they did it with remarkable efficiency and institutional coordination. The inventory, stela, was quietly moved to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it's rarely put on display and never featured in the museum's main exhibitions. It was routinely dismissed in academic publications as late-period propaganda, created by priests with questionable motives and unreliable historical knowledge. The official verdict became rigidly established. It was written over 1,000 years after Khufu's reign, making it nothing more than historical fiction designed to serve political purposes that modern scholars couldn't quite identify, but were certain must have existed. The dismissal was so thorough and so universally accepted that most Egyptology textbooks don't even mention the stela's existence, and those that do treat it as a curiosity rather than serious historical document. But that rejection creates its own logical problems that become more troubling the more carefully you examine them. The assumption that all later records are unreliable unless they support what earlier ones already say creates a circular argument that protects established narrative while preventing genuine investigation. It's a form of intellectual gatekeeping that ensures only evidence supporting the accepted timeline gets serious consideration. And here's where the official dismissal becomes even more problematic. Why would a late-period priest, writing over a millennium after Khufu's death, invent a story that systematically downplays a pharaoh's achievements? Egyptian tradition was obsessively devoted to magnifying royal accomplishments, especially those of pharaohs considered foundational to the civilization. Retroactive myth-making was incredibly common throughout Egyptian history, but it was always used to inflate rather than diminish, to associate living rulers with past greatness rather than reduce legendary figures to mere caretakers. Yet this stela does exactly the opposite. It minimizes Khufu's role in the most dramatic way possible, presenting him as a servant of older gods, a performer of restoration work, a ruler who honored ancient power rather than embodying it himself. If this was propaganda designed to serve political purposes, it represents the most counterproductive fake in the history of royal mythology. The text makes Khufu smaller, not larger. It questions his creative power rather than celebrating it. It opens mysteries rather than providing comfortable answers about Egyptian greatness. If someone was going to fabricate a historical document to support contemporary political needs, why create one that raises more questions than it answers? Modern archaeologists try to sidestep this by arguing the stela came from a nearby temple, not the Sphinx enclosure itself. But nearby in Egyptian sacred architecture means something different. These monuments were positioned with astronomical precision. Being 20 meters off doesn't indicate misplacement. It indicates ritual geometry. Even stranger, the same scholars who dismiss the inventory stela as unreliable mythology routinely use other late-period texts to support traditional timelines when convenient. The problem isn't the age of the tablet, the problem is what it says. And the more we try to explain it away, the more it whispers the same question. What if the most ancient monument in Egypt was already ancient even to the ancient Egyptians? We're taught that Khufu ordered the Great Pyramid's construction around 2580 BCE, that the Sphinx was carved during his reign, and that this represented early dynastic Egypt's technological apex. The entire foundation of Egyptology rests on this chronology, but then you have this limestone stela saying something completely different. Khufu came later. He came to preserve, not create. He came as a pilgrim, not a builder. That's not a small historical correction. That's the collapse of a timeline, because if the Sphinx existed before Khufu, then the pyramids, which align perfectly with its body, may also be older. And if they're older, then Egyptian civilization as we understand it was built on top of something it didn't begin. So we do what institutions always do with inconvenient evidence: lock it away, label it legend, and move on. But the stela remains, a stone that wasn't supposed to speak, yet continues whispering its truth. We think of history as linear progression crowned by human genius. But the inventory stela tells a different story. Not progress, but rediscovery. A king arriving at a place more ancient than memory, doing what any intelligent ruler might do when faced with mystery beyond his control. Cover it in ritual, give offerings, say very little about who built what he found, because whatever stood there wasn't broken or empty. It was silent, and that silence commanded more respect than any inscription he could add. In later centuries, the Sphinx would be buried again and again by wind, by neglect, by dynasties that found its presence inconvenient. Every time it was rediscovered, people thought they were the first to encounter this mystery. But the inventory stela proves something else. Even forgetting has a history. Even memory can be buried deliberately. The patterns of what gets preserved and what gets lost reveal as much about the preservers as the original events. So the question sharpens: if Khufu didn't build the Sphinx, who did? And what were they guarding before the pharaohs ever arrived to claim dominion over Egypt's sacred landscape? The answer to that question might lie not in what the Sphinx reveals, but in what tried to bury it. Because if you look carefully at the erosion patterns around its base, at the way water carved channels into stone that shouldn't have seen rain for thousands of years, you start to wonder whether the timeline we've been taught might be off by more than just a few centuries. Some mysteries don't just challenge what we know, they challenge when we think we knew it. And sometimes the most important question isn't who built something, but what they were trying to protect by building it in the first place. Prince Thutmose wasn't supposed to be pharaoh. His older brothers stood ahead of him in line, and in a civilization where divine bloodline determined cosmic order, that should have been the end of his story. But around 1400 BCE, something changed his destiny forever. Not through war or conspiracy, but through what he claimed was a conversation with a buried god. By the time Thutmose wandered onto the Giza plateau, the Sphinx was disappearing. The desert had been reclaiming it for generations until only the head and part of the chest remained visible above the dunes, the body, the paws, the platform, all buried. This wasn't the central icon of Egyptian religion we see today. This was a neglected stone beast ignored by priests and pilgrims alike. No festivals, no offerings, no inscriptions marking its purpose. The monument that sits at the exact junction where the rising sun meets the horizon had become invisible to the religious establishment, just sand, silence, and the outline of something once important that had been allowed to fade. Yet, Thutmose chose to rest there during a hunting expedition. Whether from exhaustion or something else that drew him to that spot, he fell asleep between the Sphinx's buried paws. What happened next became the foundation of his claim to the throne, carved into a red granite stela that still stands between the monument's front limbs today. According to his account, a divine voice spoke from within the buried lion. The Sphinx identified itself as Horamaket, the horizon god, and delivered a message that was both intimate and commanding. The voice complained of sand filling its throat, of centuries of neglect, of being forgotten by the very people who once honored its presence. It spoke of watching the sun rise alone, day after day, with no priests to acknowledge its vigil, no offerings to sustain its spiritual function. The bargain it offered was simple but profound. If Thutmose would organize the excavation to free its body from the suffocating sand, if he would restore the temples and rituals that had been abandoned, if he would remember what others had forgotten, then the throne of Egypt would be his. Not as a reward for ambition, but as a responsibility for service. The prince accepted. He organized teams of workers, cleared away tons of accumulated sand, and revealed the full, magnificent body of the Sphinx for the first time in centuries. He offered gold, incense, and prayers to the awakened deity, and established a new priesthood to maintain its worship. Within months, through a series of political developments that no contemporary records fully explain, he found himself crowned Pharaoh Thutmose IV. To historians, the dream stela represents obvious royal propaganda, a myth to justify an unexpected succession. But that explanation contains a troubling contradiction. For the story to work as propaganda, the Sphinx must have already been forgotten. Thutmose didn't claim to restore a known monument of his ancestors. He claimed to discover something buried and abandoned. Here's the fracture in Egypt's timeline. If the Sphinx was carved by Khafra only 800 years before Thutmose, how could it have been completely lost to memory? Egyptian civilization was obsessive about preserving records. Tombs were mapped, temples maintained, dynastic lineage recorded in detail. The 18th dynasty had documentation of rulers from over 1,000 years past. Yet somehow, no one remembered who built the monument beside the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx had no active cult, no priesthood, no festival calendar. It had become invisible to the very civilization that supposedly created it, until a forgotten prince heard it whisper in a dream. The dream. Stela describes the Sphinx not just as buried, but as actively suffering from its abandonment. The monument was choking beneath sand, unable to breathe, its voice muffled by centuries of neglect and deliberate forgetting. The language is remarkably personal and specific, describing not just physical burial, but spiritual starvation. The Sphinx speaks of its loneliness, its frustration at being unable to fulfill its cosmic function, its desperate need for acknowledgement and restoration. This intimate tone reflects something that makes the official dismissal even more problematic. The text doesn't read like generic royal propaganda or formulaic religious mythology. It reads like a genuine account of encountering something ancient and abandoned, something that had been waiting in silence for someone to pay attention to its condition and its needs. The steler's description of the excavation process itself provides details that seem oddly specific for a fabricated story. It mentions the particular quality of the sand, the difficulty of clearing it from the monument's limbs, the condition of the stone after centuries of burial. These aren't the kinds of details that typically appear in purely propagandistic inscriptions, which usually focus on the glory of the pharaoh rather than the mundane logistics of archaeological work. But by Thutmose's time, it wasn't just neglected, it was culturally erased, which means the Sphinx had to be older than anyone realized, old enough to have been lost and forgotten by the very people who supposedly built it. Some Egyptologists argue the Sphinx was associated with Khafra but fell into disuse during political upheavals, and Thutmose revived an old cult for political gain. But this still leaves an unsolved mystery. Why would a pharaoh stake his legitimacy on a forgotten monument unless it possessed genuine spiritual authority? The dream stela didn't give Thutmose conventional glory. It made him a servant rather than a master, a caretaker of something beyond his control. This is the opposite of effective propaganda, which emphasizes the ruler's strength and divine favor. The most haunting detail involves the stela's physical condition. The upper third of the tablet, where the Sphinx's original builder would most likely have been named, is missing. Not worn away gradually by weather and time, but broken off cleanly in what appears to be a deliberate act of concealment. The break is ancient, possibly contemporary with the original inscription, though determining its exact age would require testing that authorities have been reluctant to authorize. What remains is precisely calculated to support the narrative of divine intervention while avoiding any information that might contradict established chronology. The intact portions describe the supernatural encounter, the bargain between prince and buried god, the successful excavation, and the political reward that followed. But any mention of who originally built the monument, when it was constructed, or what civilization was responsible for its creation, has been eliminated. This selective preservation creates a perfect historical artifact, mysterious enough to be compelling, religious enough to justify political change, but incomplete enough to avoid challenging the fundamental assumptions of Egyptian chronology. It's almost as if someone understood exactly what information would be acceptable to future generations and what needed to be permanently erased. If the Sphinx had genuinely been forgotten by the 18th dynasty, then Egyptian institutional memory contained enormous gaps historians reluctantly acknowledge. It suggests the culture we think was obsessed with preserving the past had actually lost track of its most important monuments. The great pharaohs may not have been original builders of Egypt's most impressive structures, but inheritors of an architectural legacy they could maintain but not replicate. They were custodians of mysteries rather than creators, rulers who derived authority partly from preserving achievements that belonged to an earlier, forgotten period. Thutmose wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was trying to survive in a world where power came from connection to forces beyond understanding. But what did he really uncover beneath those tons of sand? The physical evidence suggests something far more complex than a simple, ancient statue that had been temporarily forgotten. The excavation revealed not just the body of the Sphinx, but evidence of multiple previous excavations, layers of different types of sand and debris that indicated the monument had been buried and cleared multiple times throughout history. There were traces of repair work from different periods using different techniques and materials that suggested various civilizations had attempted to maintain the monument across vast spans of time. Some of the restoration work appeared to be Egyptian, but other repairs seemed to use methods and materials that didn't match any known Egyptian techniques. Most intriguingly, The excavation uncovered what appeared to be much older erosion patterns on the monument's body, weathering that seemed inconsistent with the arid climate of the region. The stone showed signs of water damage, deep vertical channels carved by flowing water that would have required sustained rainfall over long periods, the kind of climate that hadn't existed in Egypt for thousands of years before the pharaohs. The monument remains today, watching the horizon where the sun rises each morning, waiting with stone patience for the next person who will stop long enough to notice its silence and wonder what it might say. Half lion, half god, fully enigmatic, it guards secrets that may be older than the civilization claiming to have built it. And those secrets might be written not in hieroglyphs or hidden chambers, but in something far more permanent and telling. They might be written in the scars the weather left behind. When you look closely at the erosion patterns Thutmose's excavation revealed, you realize the Sphinx had been telling a story all along, not just about forgotten pharaohs and buried monuments, but about forgotten time itself. The oldest monument in Egypt shows signs of the one thing Egypt doesn't have: rain. Not just droplets or occasional storms, but centuries of sustained rainfall that carved deep channels into limestone and shaped stone in ways that shouldn't exist in a desert climate. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch stood before the Sphinx enclosure and noticed something that made him question everything archaeologists had assumed about the monument's age. Schoch wasn't an Egyptologist or an archaeologist. He was a professor of geology at Boston University, trained to read the stories that rocks tell about time, climate, and natural forces. When he examined the limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx, he saw something that didn't fit the accepted narrative. Unlike the nearby temples, which show the sharp horizontal wear patterns you'd expect from thousands of years of wind and sand abrading surfaces in consistent directions, the walls around the Sphinx were different. They had vertical channels carved deep into the limestone, wavy rounded patterns and smoothed corners that created a distinctive, scalloped appearance. To a geologist, these formations looked exactly like the kind of erosion formed by water streaming downward over long periods of time. The patterns were unmistakable to someone trained in reading geological evidence. This wasn't the work of wind, which creates linear horizontal striations. This wasn't salt crystallization, which produces surface pitting and flaking. This was precipitation erosion, the kind that occurs when water flows consistently down rock faces over centuries, gradually carving channels and smoothing surfaces in ways that only sustained rainfall can accomplish. This wasn't a sandblasted ruin. It was a monument that had been rained on, not once or briefly, but repeatedly over centuries. And that presented a fundamental problem for Egyptian chronology, because the last time Egypt saw rainfall like that was over 7,000 years ago. Egypt's climate hasn't always been the arid desert we know today. During the pre-dynastic era, before the Sahara became a wasteland, North Africa was green. There were grasslands that supported grazing animals, lakes that provided fresh water for large populations, and monsoon patterns that brought regular seasonal rainfall across the region. Archaeological evidence from this period shows human settlements, rock art depicting abundant wildlife, and the remains of rivers that once flowed where now only sand exists. That wet period, sometimes called the African humid period, ended between 5000 and 4000 BCE as global climate patterns shifted, and the monsoon systems that had sustained the region for thousands of years began to fail. The transition wasn't sudden but gradual, taking place over several centuries as rainfall became less reliable, vegetation disappeared, and human populations migrated toward the Nile Valley, where water remained available. After that climatic shift, the rains stopped and the desert began its expansion across the region, transforming what had been a habitable landscape into the harsh environment we associate with Egypt today. The Sahara grew, pushing both wildlife and human civilization toward the narrow green strip along the Nile that would eventually become the foundation of pharaonic Egypt. If the enclosure around the Sphinx shows water damage from that era, it would mean the Sphinx had to already be standing thousands of years before Khafra, before Khufu, before the first pharaoh ever held a crook and flail. In other words, the Sphinx may be older than Egyptian civilization itself. Mainstream Egyptology couldn't accept that conclusion. The dating of the Sphinx has long been tied to Pharaoh Khafra, partly due to a fragmentary statue found nearby and the assumption that he built the second pyramid. Interestingly, no inscriptions actually link him directly to the Sphinx, but his name, his era, and his presumed architectural vision have become woven into the official narrative. If the Sphinx was built before Khafra, not just by a few decades but by millennia, then the entire framework of Old Kingdom chronology would collapse. The pharaohs who supposedly created Egypt's greatest monuments would be revealed as inheritors rather than innovators, caretakers of achievements that belonged to an earlier, unknown civilization. The pushback from the archaeological establishment came quickly and decisively, but it revealed as much about institutional thinking as it did about scientific methodology. Scholars claimed the erosion wasn't from water but from salt crystals in the limestone, expanding, cracking, and flaking over time as temperatures fluctuated between day and night. Others suggested that wind-driven sand could carve similar grooves given enough centuries of constant abrasion. Still others blamed groundwater rising through the rock and leaching minerals that created the observed patterns. The response seemed less concerned with examining the geological evidence than with protecting the established chronology. Academic papers dismissing the water erosion theory often spent more time defending traditional dating methods than addressing the specific patterns that Schoch had identified. The debate became not just about interpreting erosion patterns, but about whether geologists had the right to challenge conclusions that archaeologists had already settled. But these explanations faced a significant problem that became more obvious the more closely the evidence was examined. The erosion patterns simply didn't match what those alternative forces would actually create. Wind erodes surfaces horizontally, creating the sharp, linear wear visible on other monuments at Giza. Salt crystallization causes surface flaking and pitting, not deep vertical channels. And groundwater flows upward from below, not down the face of walls like rainfall would. The defensive nature of the academic response suggested that more than scientific accuracy was at stake. If the Sphinx was thousands of years older than traditionally believed, it wouldn't just change the monument's age, it would require a fundamental reconsideration of how human civilization developed, when monumental architecture first appeared, and what level of sophistication existed in prehistoric periods. Geologists pointed out that the southern and western walls of the enclosure, those most shielded from prevailing winds, showed the worst erosion. This actually supported the case for water runoff from above rather than wind-driven sand from the side. The patterns were consistent with precipitation, not with the alternative explanations being offered. There's another problem with the wind and salt theory that becomes obvious when you examine the nearby temples. The Valley Temple and Sphinx Temple were built from limestone blocks quarried directly from the Sphinx enclosure during its original carving. That means the stone used in those temples should have suffered identical weathering if it was exposed to the same conditions over the same time period. But the temple blocks don't show the same wear patterns. They're sharp, clean, and angular. They look like they've always lived in the desert, protected from whatever forces shaped the enclosure walls. Only the original excavation, the part that was exposed to the open air during the wet period, shows the rounded, water-shaped erosion. This suggests a conclusion that threatens the entire timeline. The Sphinx predates the temples beside it, and if it predates those temples, it also predates the pharaohs who supposedly built them. The construction method provides another clue that's been hiding in plain sight, revealing something about the builder's intentions and capabilities that goes beyond simple monument creation. The Sphinx wasn't carved from a freestanding block of stone that was transported to the site. It was excavated downward, cut directly from the bedrock in a massive engineering project that removed over 1,000 tons of limestone to form the body. Those quarried blocks were then stacked nearby to build the associated temples. This wasn't just stone carving, it was landscape reshaping on a scale that required sophisticated planning, advanced tools, and coordinated labor involving possibly hundreds of workers over many years. The builders didn't just create a monument. They transformed the topography of the entire area to accommodate their vision, creating a complex that integrated the carved figure with its surrounding architecture in ways that suggest comprehensive design rather than ad hoc construction. The precision of the work is remarkable. The Sphinx's body follows the natural layers of the limestone bedrock, with the builders carefully working with the stone's grain rather than against it. This suggests intimate knowledge of geological formations and engineering principles that wouldn't be out of place in modern construction projects. The drainage systems, the way the temples relate to the central figure, the astronomical alignments, all indicate a level of planning that goes far beyond what we typically associate with prehistoric construction. Maybe that's why the Sphinx doesn't appear in any pharaonic inscriptions. Maybe that's why it has no name carved beneath it, no list of rituals, no dedicatory text linking it to any known ruler. Because whoever built it wasn't interested in being remembered in the way that pharaohs typically demanded remembrance. They were interested in creating something that would endure, something that could only survive if it was made of stone, something that could only be understood if everything else was forgotten. The timeline we've constructed for Egyptian civilization, with its neat progression of dynasties, kingdoms, and calendars, begins around 3100 BCE. But the stone tells a different story, a story with no writing, no names, no royal cartouches, just patterns in erosion that whisper of a time before recorded time, when the climate was different, when the builders were different, when the very concept of monumental architecture may have served purposes we no longer understand. To accept the Sphinx as a pre-dynastic monument would mean admitting that someone, somewhere, once possessed tools, vision, and organizational capability on a scale that doesn't match our current model of human development. It would mean there was a chapter before the first chapter, a civilization whose achievements were so profound that they could only be preserved in stone, and whose builders deliberately chose anonymity over immortality. And maybe that's the most unsettling idea of all, that something so vast could exist, so close to everything we revere, and yet remain completely anonymous. Not forgotten through the accidents of time, but deliberately left unnamed, buried beneath the wrong questions, waiting for the right person to notice what the rain left behind. The implications extend beyond archaeology into questions about human capability and historical continuity. If the Sphinx represents pre-dynastic construction, it suggests that sophisticated architectural knowledge existed thousands of years before we thought it did, and that this knowledge was somehow transmitted across the climate transition that transformed the region. It raises questions about what other achievements might have been accomplished during periods we've dismissed as primitive, and what other evidence might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right expertise to recognize its significance. Every other tomb in Egypt is filled with words. Hieroglyphs cover the walls, telling stories of the dead, mapping routes to the afterlife, invoking gods and spells to ensure eternal protection. Egyptian tombs are libraries of the soul, encyclopedias of belief, carved into stone and painted in colors that were meant to last forever. But the most famous tomb of all, the Great Pyramid of Giza, has none of this. No hieroglyphs, no scenes of judgment or rebirth, no cartouches, no spells, no maps to guide the deceased through the underworld, just stone and silence, which might be the loudest thing Egypt ever left behind. The Great Pyramid, traditionally attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, stands over 140 meters high and consists of more than 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. Its internal structure is elegantly simple but far from primitive. There's a descending passage that leads to an unfinished subterranean chamber carved deep into the bedrock. A rising passage climbs to what's called the Queen's Chamber, though it was never used for that purpose, and shows no signs of ever being intended for burial. Above it all, the grand gallery opens into the King's Chamber, a rectangular granite room containing a single, open stone box. The chamber itself is built from massive granite blocks transported from quarries hundreds of miles away, fitted together with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The acoustic properties of this space are remarkable, with sound behaving in ways that suggest the builders understood principles of resonance and frequency that we're only beginning to appreciate. And that's it. No treasure, no inscriptions, not even a lid for the so-called sarcophagus. In the most sacred, central space of Egypt's greatest structure, there is nothing but empty stone and the sound of your own breathing echoing in ways that make you acutely aware of the millions of tons of stone suspended above your head. This absence is not normal by any standard of Egyptian burial practice. Egyptians believed that to be remembered was to be immortal, and they approached death with an almost frantic dedication to preservation and documentation. Names were carved onto coffins, doors, walls, tools, statues, jewelry, and even everyday objects like combs and sandals. The purpose of a tomb was not just to house a body, but to speak across eternity, to tell the gods who you were, to show the dead where to go and how to get there safely. The walls of Egyptian tombs typically functioned as instruction manuals for the afterlife. They contained detailed maps of the underworld, descriptions of the challenges the soul would face, and the specific words that needed to be spoken to overcome each obstacle. The Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, and other funerary literature were considered essential equipment for the journey to immortality, as crucial as food or clothing. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, pyramid walls were covered with pyramid texts, thousands of lines of prayers, hymns, and invocations meant to guide the pharaohs safely into the afterlife. These texts are incredibly detailed, describing everything from the proper way to greet specific gods to the exact phrases needed to convince cosmic gatekeepers to allow passage. Even minor tombs for nobles and priests had elaborate murals showing scenes of farming, music, perfume making, bread baking, and other activities from daily life rendered in vibrant color and repeated endlessly to ensure their continuation in eternity. The Egyptians left nothing to chance when it came to the afterlife. They mummified bodies, preserved organs in canopic jars, included food and drink for the journey, and surrounded the deceased with everything they might need in the next world. The idea of leaving a tomb blank, especially the tomb of a pharaoh, would have been not just unusual but spiritually dangerous. But inside Khufu's pyramid, there are no stars painted on the ceiling, no gods standing guard, no soul making its journey to judgment. Just stone, pressure, perfect angles, and complete silence. There is no scholarly consensus as to why this silence exists. Some Egyptologists propose that the pyramid was once decorated and later stripped of its inscriptions, but there is no physical evidence supporting this theory. No scratch marks from removed carvings, no ghost outlines of missing paintings, no pigment residue that would indicate the presence of hieroglyphs that were subsequently erased. Others argue that it was left intentionally undecorated because it was an early pyramid, a prototype that hadn't yet developed the elaborate decorative traditions of later monuments. But this explanation falls apart when you examine the pyramid's actual construction. The Great Pyramid is not primitive in any measurable way. Its geometry, symmetry, and alignment with the cardinal points are unmatched in precision. The base is leveled to within just 2.1 centimeters. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of 0.05 degrees. The internal passages are engineered with mathematical precision that rivals modern construction. The Grand Gallery, for instance, is built with a corbelled ceiling that distributes the weight of the stones above it so effectively that it has remained stable for over 4,500 years. The air shafts that extend from the chambers to the exterior of the pyramid are angled with precision that suggests not just engineering skill, but astronomical knowledge. Later pyramids are smaller, more fragile, and often structurally compromised. Many collapsed during construction or shortly after completion. The Pyramid of Meidum, built for Pharaoh Khufu, partially collapsed and now looks more like a tower than a pyramid. The bent pyramid of Sneferu had to have its angle changed mid-construction because the original angle was too steep and the structure was becoming unstable. If anything, the Great Pyramid represents the peak of pyramid building, a structure that seems to come from nowhere fully formed and is never equaled again. The idea that it was left undecorated because it was primitive doesn't match the evidence. If its builders had the skill to create such architectural perfection, they certainly had the ability to decorate it if they had wanted to. So why leave it blank? Khufu's name appears only once within the entire structure and not in any prominent location. A small cartouche painted in red ink on a beam inside an inaccessible space above the king's chamber was discovered by Colonel Howard Vyse in 1837. Some scholars have questioned the authenticity of this marking, noting that Vyse was under pressure to find evidence linking the pyramid to Khufu and had access to reference materials that showed how the pharaoh's name should be written. But even if we accept the cartouche as genuine, a name scribbled on a hidden ceiling beam is not a claim of ownership. It's a passing mention, a whisper, a trace, rather than a declaration. If this was truly Khufu's tomb, why wouldn't he make that fact unmistakably clear? The pharaohs before and after him carved their names into everything they touched. They built temples to themselves, wrote odes to their lineage, and left no doubt about their divine authority. Khufu, by all historical accounts, was no humble man, so if he built the greatest monument of them all, why does it say nothing about him? Some researchers suggest the pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. No body was found inside, no funerary equipment, no sarcophagus lid. Just a granite box, empty, smooth, and cold. Not built to receive a corpse, but perhaps to serve some other function entirely, to hold a resonance, to preserve a frequency, to align with celestial events in ways we don't fully understand. This isn't fringe theory. Even mainstream scholars admit that the function of the Great Pyramid remains uncertain. Its precision is extreme, its orientation is perfect. Its internal design defies simple ritual explanation. The absence of any clear burial evidence, combined with the monument's obvious technological sophistication, suggests purposes that go beyond conventional tomb construction, and its silence remains total, deliberate, and somehow meaningful. Perhaps the silence is not an omission, but the message itself. No name, no prayer, no instructions, just a presence. Something meant to be found, not read, not understood through text, but witnessed through experience, because maybe the Great Pyramid wasn't built for the people of Egypt. Maybe it wasn't built for the gods of the Nile. Maybe it was built for time itself, a structure that would outlast empires, outlive memory, and one day ask a new kind of visitor Not what they believe, but what they're willing to admit they don't know. We like to imagine the past as something we've successfully mapped, a sequence of discoveries, burials, dynasties, and dates. But the Great Pyramid doesn't confirm that story. It refuses to speak the language of history. It offers no labels, no answers, no reasons, just angles, just resonance, just mass arranged in ways that continue to challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. What kind of king builds a monument taller than memory and then leaves no message behind? Or maybe that's the wrong question. What kind of purpose requires no message at all? Because perhaps this wasn't meant to be understood in the way we understand other monuments. Perhaps it was meant to be preserved not as knowledge but as presence, a proof of concept, a fixed point in time that doesn't belong to any particular time. That kind of monument doesn't need a name. It doesn't need to be believed or worshipped or even understood. It just needs to remain. And that's exactly what it has done. When visitors stand inside the king's chamber today, they feel something strange. The silence is not empty, but dense, almost physical in its presence. The granite absorbs sound in ways that make whispers seem to disappear into the stone itself. The proportions of the chamber bend perception, making it difficult to judge distances accurately. The air feels heavier than it should, and many people report feeling slightly dizzy or disoriented after spending time in the space. Even without hieroglyphs, people whisper, as if they're trespassing, as if they're not supposed to be there, as if the place still belongs to something that hasn't left. The chamber has acoustic properties that were clearly intentional, designed to create specific effects that go beyond simple architectural function. Some researchers have suggested that the space was built to generate or amplify certain frequencies, though the purpose of such capabilities remains unknown. The experience of standing in that granite box, surrounded by millions of tons of precisely cut stone, is unlike anything else in Egypt. It doesn't feel like a tomb. It doesn't feel like a place where someone was buried. It feels like a machine, though a machine built for purposes we can't identify, using principles we don't fully understand. Maybe that's what the pyramid was built to do, not to glorify a man, but to survive the world that came after him, not to serve the religious needs of a particular culture, but to preserve something that transcends cultural boundaries. And if it succeeded in that purpose, then what else from that world might still be here, waiting to be recognized for what it actually is, rather than what we assume it should be? He built the most massive monument on Earth, a structure visible from space, aligned to the stars, composed of over 2 million blocks, each placed with sub-millimeter precision. And yet, no one ever found his body. Pharaoh Khufu, lord of the 4th dynasty, is credited with commissioning the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure so mathematically perfect, so enduring, that it has survived over 4,000 years of earthquakes, invasions, and empire collapse. It is, by every official account, his tomb. But there's a problem. No mummy, no grave goods, no inscriptions, no sign of a burial, just an empty box, open, silent, cold. The man who supposedly built the greatest tomb in history has no grave. We know what Egyptian burials look like, especially for kings, because we've found so many of them. From the Valley of the Kings to the tombs of Saqqara, pharaohs were entombed with intricate care that bordered on obsession. The process could take months and involved hundreds of people working to ensure the deceased ruler's successful transition to the afterlife. Sarcophagi were nested within sarcophagi, each layer carved with protective spells and divine imagery. Amulets were placed on specific parts of the body according to precise ritual requirements. Scrolls containing the Book of the Dead were positioned near the head so the deceased could read the necessary incantations during their journey through the underworld. Shabtis, small figurines, were included to serve as workers in the afterlife, handling any manual labor the dead pharaoh might be required to perform. Walls were covered in spells and maps of the Dua, the Egyptian underworld, providing detailed navigation instructions for the soul's journey. Scenes of divine judgment showed the deceased being weighed against the feather of Ma'at, with step-by-step illustrations of what would happen at each stage of the process. Offerings of food, drink, and precious objects were arranged according to specific protocols. Torches were positioned to provide light in the darkness of death. Funerary boats were included to transport the soul across the celestial waters. Even the pharaoh's organs were carefully preserved in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity and positioned according to the cardinal directions. Nothing was left to chance. The entire process was designed to ensure that the deceased ruler would not only survive death, but would thrive in the afterlife, maintaining their royal status and divine authority in the realm of the gods. Even minor nobles were buried with family inscriptions, painted reliefs, food, tools, and symbols of their station. Death was orchestrated in ancient Egypt not just to bury the body, but to guide the soul through the complex journey to immortality. Yet inside the Great Pyramid, supposedly the grandest of them all, none of this exists. No gold, no coffins, not even a name. Just a single stone chamber with a box that might have once held something, or maybe never did. Some claim that Khufu's burial was looted in antiquity, that robbers stole the body, broke open the coffin, and took the treasure. But that theory doesn't hold up under careful examination. There are no signs of forced entry anywhere in the pyramid. The passages leading to the king's chamber show no evidence of having been sealed and then broken open. There are no chisel marks on the sarcophagus, indicating attempts to break it open or pry off a lid. There are no broken fragments of ritual objects scattered around the chamber, no pottery shards from smashed canopic jars, no pieces of destroyed wooden furniture or ritual implements. There's no soot from torches that would have been needed to illuminate the dark passages during a robbery. There are no collapsed tunnels or abandoned tools that would indicate hurried excavation by tomb robbers. Most tellingly, the box itself, often called a sarcophagus, has no lid, no carvings, no ornamentation of any kind. It doesn't even resemble the elaborate coffins used by later pharaohs, which were typically carved with intricate designs covered in gold leaf and inscribed with protective spells. This is just a stone rectangle, perfectly cut but completely plain, and if you believe it once held a king, you have to believe that every trace of him was removed so thoroughly that not even dust remained. You have to believe that robbers were so meticulous that they cleaned out every particle of evidence, every fragment of bone, every scrap of fabric, every trace of the oils and resins used in mummification. That level of thoroughness is inconsistent with how tomb robbing actually worked in ancient Egypt, where thieves were typically interested in grabbing valuable objects as quickly as possible, not in erasing all evidence of their activities. Some Egyptologists suggest that Khufu may have been buried elsewhere, that perhaps the pyramid was a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb built to honor the pharaoh while his actual remains were interred in a different location, or that his real burial chamber lies in a still undiscovered hidden vault beneath or within the structure, waiting to be found by future archaeologists with better technology. But despite over a century of intensive excavation, surveying and scanning using the most advanced techniques available, no second chamber has ever been found. No tunnel leading to a hidden burial site, no stairway descending to a secret vault, no inscription pointing the way to the pharaoh's true resting place. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped the interior of the pyramid in unprecedented detail. Seismic surveys have detected no hidden chambers. Electromagnetic scanning has revealed no concealed passages. Teams of archaeologists have systematically explored every accessible part of the structure, measured every angle, investigated every irregularity in the stonework. In 2017, a large void was discovered above the Grand Gallery using cosmic ray muon detectors, a breakthrough that generated worldwide excitement among Egyptologists. But no one knows what's inside this space. It remains sealed, untouched, inaccessible. The void could contain burial goods, or it could be an empty structural element designed to reduce the weight pressing down on the Grand Gallery. It could be a chamber filled with treasure, or it could be nothing more than a gap in the masonry, a blank above a blank. Silence inside silence. Even this potentially significant discovery only adds to the mystery rather than solving it. There are small satellite pyramids near the Great Pyramid that provide interesting contrasts to the main structure. One holds the remains of a woman, possibly Khufu's mother, Hetepheres, or one of his consorts. The burial was elaborate, with gold jewelry, furniture, and canopic jars containing preserved organs. Another smaller pyramid may have belonged to a daughter. Others are empty, but show evidence of having been designed for burial purposes. But none of these subsidiary structures bear Khufu's name or contain any evidence of his burial. They demonstrate that the technology and materials for proper royal burial were available during his reign, that the religious protocols were understood and followed, that the artisans and priests knew how to create appropriate tomb decorations and burial goods. We have statues of Khufu, small, rare, scattered across different museums. We have administrative documents referencing his reign, including the diary of the transport official Mira that describes moving limestone to the pyramid construction site. We even have graffiti on stone blocks left by quarrymen from his time, casual inscriptions that provide glimpses into the daily life of workers during the pyramid's construction. But we do not have his tomb, and that makes him unique among pharaohs. Almost every ruler of the Old Kingdom has a burial site, even if it's been damaged, looted, or incompletely excavated. Their tombs are modest, damaged, incomplete, but traceable. Khufu, the most powerful builder of all, the pharaoh who commanded the resources to create the most impressive monument in human history, vanishes completely when it comes to his own death and burial. So if the Great Pyramid isn't his tomb, what is it? Why design a monument of such scale and precision and then not use it? Why would a king pour decades of labor, logistics, and royal authority into a structure that left no memory of his body, his spirit, or his name? Unless it wasn't a tomb at all. Unless the idea of tomb was a placeholder, a word used because no other explanation made sense. The problem isn't just the absence of a body, it's the absence of purpose. The Great Pyramid doesn't fulfill any known funerary function. It doesn't follow ritual design, it doesn't contain offerings, chambers of the gods, or celestial maps. Its geometry, its mass, its alignment, its time encoded in stone, but it's not a grave. Which raises a darker question. Did we call it a tomb just to stop ourselves from asking what it really was? We are so used to calling it a tomb that we've forgotten to ask what that word hides. We repeat it like a spell, as if saying it often enough will make it true. But there's a difference between a monument to death and a structure that refuses to die. And maybe that's the real function of the Great Pyramid, not to bury a king, but to bury a question, to anchor something in place so massive, so undeniable that no one would ever dare ask, why is it here, and where is he? Because the truth is, we don't know where Khufu is. We have no confirmed mummy, no confirmed tomb, and no direct inscription tying him to the pyramid we say is his. All we have is an assumption, and a box, and a story built on both. But what if the pyramid was never meant to hold a body? What if it was meant to hold time, a chamber, not for death, but for preservation of structure, of alignment, of something else entirely? Something the king wanted remembered or forgotten long after he was gone. And what if that something wasn't even about him? This possibility opens up the most disturbing questions of all. If the Great Pyramid wasn't built for Khufu's burial, if it doesn't serve any recognizable Egyptian religious function, if it was constructed using organizational methods that seem designed to hide its true purpose, even from the people building it, then what was it really for? The structure's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, its acoustic properties, its resistance to natural disasters, all suggest purposes that go beyond conventional tomb construction. It was built to last not just for a pharaoh's afterlife, but for geological timescales. It was designed to survive not just political upheavals, but the collapse of entire civilizations. Maybe Khufu's absence from the pyramid isn't a mystery to be solved, but a clue to be recognized. Maybe the structure was never intended to serve his personal needs, but to preserve something that transcended any individual ruler, any particular dynasty, any specific culture. Something that required the resources of a pharaoh to build, but was never meant to belong to that pharaoh. The question isn't where Khufu was buried. The question is what he was commissioned to preserve, and why that preservation required such extreme measures, such elaborate secrecy, such complete anonymity that even the builder's own burial place had to be hidden or eliminated entirely. The only written record we have from the time of Khufu doesn't describe a god, a king, or a tomb. It describes a boat and the men who filled it with stone. In 2013, a team of French and Egyptian archaeologists made a discovery on the shores of the Red Sea at a site called Wadi al-Jarf that would provide the most direct contemporary evidence we have of activity during Khufu's reign. The location itself is significant. A remote harbour installation that had been abandoned for over 4,000 years, preserved by the dry desert climate in a way that would be impossible in the humid Nile Valley. Inside a series of ancient storage caves carefully sealed with stone blocks, they found hundreds of fragments of papyrus. The preservation was extraordinary. Some pieces were brittle, some blank, but one scroll stood out not just for its condition, but for its content. It was a diary, the personal logbook of a man named Mera, an official of modest rank, whose job wasn't to rule or design or build, but to manage one of the most complex transportation operations in ancient history. The papyri represent the oldest known papyrus documents in Egypt, dating to the 27th year of Khufu's reign. They provide an unprecedented window into the administrative machinery that made massive construction projects possible. Day by day, Mera documented the loading and shipping of limestone blocks from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile, westward towards something called the Akhet Khufu. That phrase is usually translated as horizon of Khufu, and most scholars believe it refers to the Great Pyramid. It's the closest thing we've ever found to a construction record from Khufu's time, and yet it doesn't actually describe any construction. Mera's diary is practical, precise, and remarkably dull, considering the magnitude of what he was documenting. He describes where the stone was cut using technical terms for different types of limestone that suggest sophisticated knowledge of material properties. He details how blocks were loaded onto boats, mentioning specific loading techniques and weight distribution methods. He records where shipments docked, which officials signed off on each delivery, who received the materials at their destination. The logs mention ramps, crews, supervisors, and rotation schedules. They describe the coordination of multiple teams, the management of seasonal work patterns, and the complex logistics of moving tons of stone across water. It's bureaucratic language, the voice of someone doing his job rather than writing for posterity, but it reveals an operation of staggering complexity and precision. Yet throughout all these detailed records, he never mentions the pyramid itself, never describes what the stone was used for, never hints at any ritual, design, or ultimate goal. The closest he comes to describing purpose is referring to the destination as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, a phrase that could refer to the pyramid but could also mean something else entirely. It's a logistics report, a manifest, an inventory of movement rather than meaning. And this documentary approach raises questions about the nature of the project itself. This creates a strange irony. For decades, people have asked where the evidence is that Khufu built the Great Pyramid. We have no inscriptions inside it, no architectural plans, no artist sketches, no dedication ceremonies recorded anywhere. Just this, a transport diary found in a cave far from Giza, written by a man who may have never even seen the structure he was helping to supply. And from that single document, a chain of assumptions was built. The papyri were hailed by Egyptologists as the smoking gun, proof at last that Khufu directed the construction of the Great Pyramid. The reasoning seems straightforward. The limestone went to his horizon, the dates match, Mera's name appears in connection with Khufu's projects. Case closed. But step back and consider the implications. If the pyramid was the most important project of the era, a divine tomb built to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife, why is the only written record we have from Khufu's time a shipping log? Why do we know what boat the stones came on but not what shape they were intended to create? There are no hieroglyphs describing the pyramid's architectural plan, no ritual texts outlining its sacred purpose, no records of its completion, dedication, or consecration. In a culture that documented funerals down to the position of each feather on the priest's headdress, the silence surrounding the pyramid remains overwhelming. Mera's diary, instead of solving the mystery, only makes the silence louder. Because now we know the stone was moved. We know when, we know how, but we still don't know why. There's also something unsettling about the tone of Mera's records. They show no awe, no reverence, no sense that he was participating in a civilization project. He's not a servant of the gods recording divine work. He's a contractor, signing off on shipments, logging dates, mentioning delays and labor rotations. Nothing about his language suggests he understood, or was meant to understand, what he was contributing to. That detachment is telling because it implies the pyramid wasn't a statewide divine endeavor with everyone working toward a shared religious goal. It was a fragmented operation, possibly managed in compartments where workers knew only their specific tasks. Need-to-know information, stone by stone, no big picture. This compartmentalization would have been necessary for a project of this scale, but it also suggests something else: deliberate information control. In most Egyptian construction projects, workers understood the religious significance of their labor. Building a temple or tomb was considered sacred work, and that understanding was part of what motivated people to participate in demanding, dangerous construction tasks. But Mera's records suggest a different kind of operation, one where the spiritual or ultimate purpose was hidden even from the people making it possible. This level of secrecy is unusual in Egyptian construction and raises questions about what exactly was being built and why its true nature needed to be concealed, which raises another question. What kind of structure requires secrecy even from the people who built it? We imagine ancient Egypt as a civilization obsessed with legacy, where every brick was laid in honor of the afterlife, where every name was carved to echo across eternity. But this diary doesn't echo, it measures, it calculates, it ends. Mera doesn't speak of gods, he doesn't speak of Khufu's divine mission, he doesn't speak of purpose, only stone, only movement, only weight. And when the shipments stop, so does the diary, no conclusion, no monument, no sign that he ever saw what became of the work. This isn't a record of creation, it's a record of distance, how far stone traveled, how far memory can erode, how far the builders were kept from the vision. And maybe that's the point. Because if you wanted to build something vast, something meant to survive, flood, fire, conquest, and time, you wouldn't need belief from your workers. You'd need labor, you'd need obedience, and you'd need silence. The kind that keeps people moving without asking why. The papyri reveal something else that's troubling about the scale and sophistication of the operation. Meera's logs show a level of organizational complexity that goes beyond what we typically imagine for ancient construction projects. The logistics of moving massive stone blocks across water, coordinating multiple crews working in different locations, maintaining supply schedules across seasons, and managing complex transportation networks required administrative capabilities that rival modern project management. The operation involved multiple types of boats, specialized loading equipment, coordinated work crews, supply chain management, and quality control systems. The records mention specific officials responsible for different aspects of the operation, suggesting a hierarchical management structure with clear lines of authority and accountability. This wasn't a simple construction project, but a sophisticated industrial operation. Yet this sophisticated operation was apparently conducted without anyone involved understanding or recording the ultimate purpose. The workers knew their tasks, the supervisors knew their schedules, the officials knew their quotas, but the bigger picture remained hidden. This suggests not just secrecy but systematic compartmentalization, as if the knowledge of what was being built was deliberately restricted to as few people as possible. The implications are unsettling. If the pyramid was indeed Khufu's tomb, why the secrecy? Egyptian tomb construction was typically a public affair, with priests, artists, and workers all participating in creating a pharaoh's pathway to the afterlife. The religious significance of the work was supposed to be part of what motivated people to participate in demanding, dangerous construction tasks. But Meera's diary suggests something different. A project where workers were told only what they needed to know to do their jobs, where the transportation of materials was treated as routine logistics rather than sacred duty, where the ultimate purpose remained hidden even from the people making it possible. This raises questions that go beyond the pyramid's construction to its fundamental nature. If it wasn't built as a conventional tomb, if it wasn't meant to serve the religious needs that other pyramids clearly addressed, then what was it for? And why was its true purpose considered so sensitive that even the workers building it couldn't be trusted with that knowledge? The diary ends as abruptly as it begins, with no explanation of what happened to the stone once it reached its destination. Meera simply stops writing as if his part in the project was finished, and he moved on to other assignments. There's no sense of completion, no celebration of achievement, no acknowledgement that he had participated in creating one of the wonders of the world. Just silence, the same silence that fills the pyramid's empty chambers, the same silence that surrounds its true purpose, the same silence that has protected its secrets for over 4,000 years. And perhaps that silence was always the point. Perhaps the pyramid was built not to communicate but to endure, not to explain but to preserve, not to glorify a pharaoh but to serve a purpose so important that it couldn't be trusted to writing, couldn't be shared with workers, couldn't be preserved in any form except the structure itself. If that's the case, then Meera's diary becomes not evidence of pyramid construction, but evidence of how successfully that purpose was hidden. The most comprehensive record we have of activity during Khufu's reign is also the most limited, the most bureaucratic, the most deliberately uninformative document imaginable. It tells us everything about how the pyramid was built and nothing about why, and maybe that's exactly what it was designed to do. A robot entered the pyramid to find answers. Instead, it found a door that no one seems willing to open. It wasn't built for people, not for priests, not for kings, not for the dead. It was too narrow, too precise, too deliberately hidden. just a shaft, barely 20 centimeters wide, tucked into the southern wall of the Queen's Chamber, one of the least understood rooms inside the Great Pyramid. No one knew why it was there, no one could fit inside, so for centuries it was ignored. Until 1993, when a small, wheeled robot crawled inside the pyramid for the first time and found something that no one was ready to explain. A door, smooth, polished, fitted perfectly to the stone tunnel. And embedded in that door, 2 copper pins, not handles, not hinges, just protrusions, deliberate, symbolic, silent. Behind the copper door, no one knew. And after that day, no one seemed particularly eager to find out. The robot's name was Upuaut II, meaning opener of the ways, a name borrowed from an ancient Egyptian god. It was built by German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink, who had been contracted to help ventilate the pyramid and inspect its internal shafts. Most of the air ducts inside the Great Pyramid are sloped stone channels, sealed at both ends, non-functional in any real sense, too small for human access, too angled to serve structural purposes, too precise to be random. They rise from the Queen's Chamber, one leading north, one south. At first, they were assumed to be symbolic, perhaps celestial alignments, or ritual airways, but they went nowhere, served no apparent function, connected to nothing, until Gantenbrink's robot proved otherwise. As Upuaut II climbed the southern shaft, a steep, claustrophobic incline over 60 meters long, it transmitted live footage back to the surface. The footage was remarkable not just for what it revealed, but for what it demonstrated about the pyramid's internal construction. Viewers watched the interior walls flash by, clean, precise, untouched by air or time. The shaft was perfectly constructed with smooth limestone walls and precise angles that demonstrated the same engineering sophistication found throughout the pyramid. The robot's progress was slow and methodical. The shaft rose at a steep angle, too steep for any human to have climbed, even if the passage had been large enough. The walls showed no tool marks, no irregularities, no signs of the cutting and shaping process that must have created them. They were finished to a degree that seemed unnecessary for a passage no one was supposed to see. The limestone blocks were fitted together with the same precision found in the pyramid's exterior, each joint invisible, each surface smooth. The shaft maintained a consistent cross-section throughout its length, never varying, never showing the kinds of adjustments that would be expected in ancient construction. It was as if the entire passage had been planned and executed as a single, coherent design rather than assembled piece by piece. Then suddenly the shaft ended, not in a collapse, not in a rough wall, but in a carefully set stone slab, rectangular, smooth, and impossibly out of place. The robot's light revealed the 2 copper pins, hammered flat, protruding slightly, with no apparent purpose. No hinges, no latch, no writing. Just a door where there should have been none. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Here was physical evidence of something hidden within the pyramid, something that had been sealed for over 4,000 years, something that contradicted the assumption that the pyramid's interior had been fully explored and mapped. The implications were staggering. If there were sealed chambers in the Queen's Chamber shafts, what other hidden spaces might exist within the structure? Media coverage was intense. The discovery was featured on television documentaries, newspaper front pages, and academic journals around the world. The image of the door with its mysterious copper pins became iconic, representing both the enduring mysteries of ancient Egypt and the potential for new discoveries using modern technology. But the excitement was short-lived. The world took notice, but so did Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, and their response was swift and decisive. Shortly after the discovery, Gantenbrink was removed from the project. His contract was terminated, his access to the pyramid was revoked, and his research was effectively shut down. No explanation was provided, no formal rejection was issued, just silence. The official reason given was that Gantenbrink had exceeded his mandate, which was limited to ventilation work rather than exploration. But critics pointed out that the discovery had been made in the course of legitimate shaft inspection, and that cutting off the investigation at the moment of breakthrough seemed counterproductive to the goals of archaeological research. The door had refused to open, and now so had the conversation. Nearly a decade passed before another attempt was made to investigate the mysterious door. The delay was never officially explained, but it suggested that authorities were in no hurry to pursue discoveries that might complicate the established narrative about the pyramid's purpose and contents. In 2002, a new team was finally granted access to the pyramid and brought a second robot, this time equipped with a drill. The robot was more sophisticated than Gantenbrink's original device, with better cameras, more precise drilling capabilities, and fiber optic technology that could provide detailed images of spaces beyond physical barriers. The world watched again through cameras embedded in the robot. Live broadcasts promised answers that had been delayed for 9 years, and expectations were high that this expedition would finally reveal what lay behind the mysterious door. The robot approached the same southern shaft, reached the same door, and carefully drilled a small hole through the stone slab. The drilling process itself was revealing. The stone was incredibly hard, requiring specialized equipment and considerable time to penetrate. The door wasn't just symbolically sealed, it was engineered to resist intrusion. A fiber optic camera was inserted through the hole, and the image came back to eager viewers around the world. Everyone leaned forward, expecting treasure, inscriptions, or some revelation that would justify the years of waiting and speculation. Behind the door was another chamber, stone walls precisely cut, empty, silent, and on the far wall a second door, no hieroglyphs, no gold, no artifacts, just more precision, more geometry, more refusal to provide easy answers. That was the last official report. There was no third expedition, no public excavation, no attempt to open the second door. The press cycle ended, the world moved on, but the question stayed behind. Why does a shaft too narrow for humans and too precise to be accidental climb upward into the core of the pyramid and end at a sealed chamber? Why build a door and then hide another one behind it? And why did the investigation stop the moment things got interesting? Some said the mystery was solved, that the shafts were symbolic, that the doors meant nothing, that the second chamber was empty, and so the story was too. But emptiness isn't absence. Sometimes it's the most precise kind of design, because a sealed door isn't just a barrier, it's a choice. Someone, thousands of years ago, carved a passage no person could enter, polished its edges, set copper pins like eyes that would never blink, and then placed a second wall behind the first. Not to confuse, but to delay. It's not a tomb, it's not a message, it's a test, not of tools, but of patience. And maybe the people who built it didn't want it opened until the right moment, or the right question, or the right kind of silence. We often assume that if something is sealed, it must contain treasure. But what if the treasure was never meant to be inside? What if the door itself is the answer? A device designed not to open, but to make you ask why it was built at all. The copper pins are particularly intriguing because copper doesn't belong in stone construction. It's a different material, deliberately chosen, carefully placed, and it would have been expensive and difficult to work with using ancient tools. In ancient Egyptian symbolism, copper was associated with the gods, with divine power, with things that connected earth to heaven. It was used in religious artifacts, royal regalia, and sacred implements. The pins aren't functional in any mechanical sense. They don't serve as hinges, handles, or structural elements. They're too small and positioned too awkwardly to be useful for opening or closing the door, but they're clearly intentional, clearly significant, placed with the same precision that characterizes every other element of the pyramid's construction. Their placement suggests they might be markers, indicators, signs pointing to something that can't be accessed through conventional exploration, but through understanding, through recognizing the purpose of the barrier itself. They might be telling us that what lies beyond the door isn't meant to be accessed through physical tools, but through comprehension of why the door was built in the first place. The engineering required to create these shafts and chambers is extraordinary, even by the standards of the Great Pyramid. The precision of the angles, the smoothness of the surfaces, the perfect fitting of the doors, all demonstrate capabilities that challenge our assumptions about ancient technology. The shafts maintain exact alignments over distances of more than 60 meters, with no deviation that would be detectable without precision instruments. But more than the technical achievement, they demonstrate intentions that challenge our assumptions about ancient purposes. Why would builders invest such enormous effort in creating chambers that no one could access? Why construct doors that weren't meant to be opened? Why embed symbolic elements in places where no one was supposed to see them? The answer might be that the chambers weren't built for people to enter, but for people to discover, to wonder about, to be changed by the very existence of something beyond their reach. The sealed doors might be the most honest expression of the pyramid's true purpose, not to provide access, but to create questions that can't be easily answered. And if that's true, then the real purpose of the pyramid was never funerary, never spiritual in the conventional sense, never functional in the way we understand function. It was philosophical. A machine not for death but for memory, designed to trap it, compress it, hold it still, until someone, someday, would stop asking how it was built and start asking what it means that no one is allowed to finish it. The door that refused to open might be the pyramid's most honest feature. It doesn't pretend to offer answers. It doesn't promise treasure or revelation. It simply exists, perfectly sealed, precisely placed, waiting for the moment when we stop trying to break it down and start trying to understand why it was built to remain closed. Perhaps that's the real test embedded in the pyramid's design, not whether we can develop the technology to open every sealed chamber, but whether we can develop the wisdom to recognize when something is meant to remain sealed. The door might be teaching us that some questions are more valuable than their answers, that some mysteries serve a purpose that would be destroyed by solving them. The pyramid builders may have understood something that we're only beginning to grasp, that the most profound human experiences come not from possessing knowledge, but from encountering the limits of knowledge, from standing before something that remains forever just beyond our reach. In that sense, the robot that found the door succeeded beyond its programming. It wasn't just an opener of ways, as its name suggested. It was a discoverer of boundaries, a revealer of the carefully constructed limits that define the pyramid's true purpose. There is a chamber beneath the Sphinx. We've known this for decades, but no one talks about it anymore. It's not just what stands above the desert that makes Giza strange. It's what lies beneath the pores of the Sphinx, beneath the Great Pyramid, beneath the stone causeways and shrines. There is a shadow. Not of architecture, but of absence, because Giza is not just a plateau, it's hollow. For more than a century, people have entered what they found there, only for those entrances to disappear. In the 19th century, early explorers reported strange features below the surface that didn't match their expectations of what should exist beneath ancient monuments. Cavities, tunnels, voids that seemed too regular to be natural, too extensive to be simple tomb shafts. British Egyptologist Ernest Alfred Wallace Budge described subterranean chambers of uncertain origin that extended far beyond what would be needed for burial purposes. Napoleon's scholars, during their systematic survey of Egypt, mapped passages, chambers that no longer appear on any modern archaeological plan. The Napoleon expedition's documentation is particularly significant because it was conducted before modern tourism and development altered the site. Their surveyors had access to areas that are now restricted or have been sealed off entirely. Their maps show a complex network of underground passages that connect various points beneath the plateau, suggesting a coordinated design rather than random excavation. In 1926, author Herbert Eustace Winlock wrote of catacombs extending below the plateau, some filled with rubble that appeared to have been deliberately placed, others curiously clean and empty as if they had been maintained or recently cleared. His descriptions included chambers with carved walls, stairways that descended far deeper than would be necessary for typical burial purposes, and passages that seemed to follow geometric patterns rather than the irregular layouts typical of natural caves or hastily dug tombs. But the deeper these reports went, the quieter they became. No museum built replicas of the underground chambers. No schools taught about the lower layers of Giza. Most Egyptologists dismissed them as natural fissures, unfinished tomb shafts, or the exaggerations of colonial-era explorers who didn't understand what they were seeing. But the maps still exist. They show corridors beneath the Sphinx, stairs cut into bedrock, walls too straight to be natural, levels that descend past the water table into a part of the past we weren't meant to re-enter. The most documented of these underground features is the Osiris Shaft, located near Khafra's Causeway. This vertical tunnel descends over 30 meters into the limestone bedrock and contains 3 distinct levels that become increasingly mysterious the deeper you go. The upper chamber is small and simple, accessible by a narrow shaft that requires specialized equipment to navigate safely. The second chamber is flooded with groundwater, which has prevented thorough exploration but also helped preserve whatever lies beneath the surface. The third level contains a large room with 6 side niches carved with precision that rivals the workmanship visible in the pyramid chambers above ground. In the center sits an empty stone sarcophagus, but calling it a sarcophagus may be misleading. The stone box shows no signs of ever having contained a burial. There are no stains from decomposition, no residue from mummification materials, no wear patterns that would indicate it was used for its supposed purpose. The chamber's acoustics are remarkable. Sound behaves strangely in the space, with whispers carrying clearly across the room, while normal conversation seems muffled. The walls show tool marks that are consistent throughout, suggesting the entire chamber was carved by the same team using the same techniques. But the tools that created those marks would have been advanced for any period of Egyptian history, requiring precision and durability that challenges our assumptions about ancient technology. No inscriptions anywhere, no offerings, no sign that anyone was ever buried there, worshipped there, or even spent significant time there. When it was first explored, researchers expected to find a tomb that would provide insight into Old Kingdom burial practices. What they found was a silence even deeper than the one inside the Great Pyramid. The shaft is not open to the public. It's not part of the official tourist trail. Very few archaeologists are granted access. No comprehensive study has been published. The name Osiris was assigned later, based on association rather than evidence, because the chamber's actual purpose remains unknown. If it isn't a tomb and it isn't a cistern for storing water, then what is it? A ritual space? A chamber designed for acoustic properties? A foundation element from a time before foundations? Whatever it is, It doesn't fit the established narrative about how the Giza Plateau was used. In 2008, a team of Egyptian researchers began re-examining the ground beneath the Giza Plateau using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced scanning technologies. The survey was more comprehensive than any previous investigation, covering not just the area directly beneath the monuments, but the entire plateau and extending into the surrounding desert. They detected voids, tunnels, and chambers throughout the subsurface area, creating a three-dimensional map of the underground network that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The results were startling. The scans revealed chambers beneath every major monument, connecting passages that seemed to follow deliberate geometric patterns and structural elements that suggested the entire plateau had been modified at some point in the distant past. Some features matched those documented in colonial-era maps, confirming that earlier explorers had indeed discovered real architectural elements rather than natural formations. But other discoveries were completely unknown to modern archaeology. The scans detected large voids beneath the Sphinx that were clearly artificial, with regular geometric shapes that couldn't be explained by natural erosion. They found evidence of chambers beneath the Great Pyramid that didn't connect to any known internal passages, suggesting that the underground network was separate from and possibly predated the pyramid's construction. Photos surfaced showing passages lined with cut stone, crude steps descending into darkness, archways and block walls, carved surfaces that had never been officially documented or studied. The construction techniques visible in these images didn't match the sophisticated masonry found in the pyramids above ground, but they also didn't look like the rough work typically associated with unfinished tomb shafts. The discoveries suggested a complex underground network that extended far beyond anything that had been publicly acknowledged, raising questions about who built these chambers, when they were constructed, and why their existence has been systematically concealed from public knowledge. And then access was revoked. When journalists asked for more information, the Egyptian authorities stated plainly, "There is nothing there." That was the official position. No explanation of the photographs, no acknowledgement of the radar data, no discussion of the historical maps. Just a blank denial. The tunnels that had been documented, mapped and partially entered were sealed again. This pattern isn't new. In the 1930s, an excavation beneath the Sphinx reportedly revealed a chamber between the pores. Workers described descending into a cavity that showed signs of artificial construction, but it was quickly backfilled and no official report was ever published. Later radar scans confirmed the existence of a hollow space in the same location. Again, the official explanation was natural fissure, but no independent researchers were allowed to verify that claim. If you ask Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities today whether there's anything beneath the Sphinx, the answer is simple: no. But the maps say otherwise, the scans say otherwise, the silence, by now almost institutional, says otherwise. The strange thing is that no one's actually denying that the tunnels exist, they're just denying that they matter. But when something is photographed, measured, explored, and then suddenly declared irrelevant, that's not archaeology, that's erasure. And erasure has a pattern. It doesn't destroy everything, it just closes the door before the questions get too loud, because the deeper you go beneath Giza, the older things look, the cleaner the cuts become, the more precise the angles, the less they resemble tombs, and the more they resemble infrastructure. Not graves, but design. Not burial chambers, but foundation elements for something much larger than what we see on the surface. The underground network suggests that the pyramid complex, as we understand it, may be only the visible portion of something much more extensive. The chambers and passages beneath the plateau could be the remains of an earlier construction phase, or they could belong to an entirely different period of building that predates the pharaohs we associate with the site. This raises questions that go beyond archaeology into politics and institutional control. Why would authorities be so determined to prevent investigation of underground features? What could be discovered beneath the sand that would be so disruptive to established narratives that it's worth denying access to legitimate researchers? The answer might lie in what those underground chambers represent. If they're older than the pyramids above them, if they show evidence of construction techniques that don't match what we know about Old Kingdom capabilities, if they suggest that the Giza Plateau was a site of major construction activity long before the pharaohs arrived to build their monuments, then they threaten the entire chronology of Egyptian civilization. What if the real secret of the pyramids isn't inside the chambers we can see? What if it's below them, in spaces that were already ancient when the pharaohs decided to build on top of them? Not something spiritual or technological, just something earlier, a layer of meaning so old that dynastic Egypt had already forgotten it. So they built on top of it, like every empire does when it finds ruins it can't explain. They gave the Sphinx a name, built temples next to its paws, ascribed myths to its silence. But they never claimed to have made it. Maybe because they didn't, and maybe what's buried beneath the sand isn't a body, or a tomb, or a treasure. Maybe it's a memory that wasn't supposed to survive, evidence of a chapter of human history that was meant to remain buried under tons of stone and thousands of years of official silence. The pattern of concealment suggests that whatever lies beneath Giza represents more than just archaeological curiosity. It threatens something fundamental about how we understand the development of human civilization, the timeline of technological advancement, and the origins of the sophisticated knowledge that made the pyramids possible. If the underground chambers predate the pyramids, if they demonstrate capabilities that don't fit our model of ancient Egyptian development, if they connect to a broader network of construction that extends throughout the plateau, then they raise questions that go far beyond Egyptology. They challenge our basic assumptions about human progress, about the continuity of civilization, about what knowledge existed in the distant past and how it was lost. Maybe that's why the doors keep closing. Maybe that's why the official position is so consistently dismissive, because some discoveries are too dangerous to acknowledge, not because they threaten national security or archaeological careers, but because they threaten the stories we tell ourselves about our own place in history. It was said to be the only surviving text that described the pyramids before Egypt. But before anyone could read it, it burned. It was never translated, never archived, never photographed. But for a few brief weeks in the 1800s, it existed. A scroll written in Coptic, fragile and frayed, said to contain the oldest known description of the pyramids, not from the age of pharaohs, not from priests or dynasties, from before. And then it burned. The story begins, as many strange ones do, with a monk. In the late 19th century, a collector traveling through Cairo met an elderly Coptic cleric in one of the city's quieter monasteries. The historical context is important here. This was during the height of European interest in Egyptian antiquities, when collectors and scholars were scouring the country for artifacts and texts that might provide new insights into ancient civilization. The monk claimed to be the custodian of a small bundle of manuscripts passed down in his order for generations, fragments of early Christian, pre-Islamic writings that had never left Egypt. Coptic monasteries had long served as repositories for ancient texts, preserving materials that might otherwise have been lost during the various political and religious upheavals that had swept through the region over the centuries. The preservation of manuscripts in Coptic monasteries was not unusual. These communities had maintained libraries and scriptoriums for over 1,000 years, often copying and recopying texts to ensure their survival. Many important early Christian texts and Gnostic writings had been preserved this way, including the Nag Hammadi library discovered in the 20th century. But one scroll in the monk's collection stood out from the others. It was written in a mix of Sahidic Coptic, one of the major dialects of the Coptic language, and older phrases that the monk could not read or translate. This linguistic mixture was significant because it suggested the text had been copied from sources that used even earlier languages, possibly predating the development of Coptic as a written language. But one scroll stood out. It was written in a mix of Sahidic, Coptic, and older phrases the monk could not read. It described a land along the Nile before the Nile as we know it, before the Great Bend, before the Delta formed. It mentioned 3 great beacons of stone, not by name, but by alignment. And it suggested they had been sealed, not as tombs, but as vaults of memory. When the collector asked what it meant, the monk only said, "They were built before language, before the Nile changed." The collector, believed to have been Austrian or French, purchased the scroll along with several others. He took them back to Europe, where they were to be examined by Orientalist scholars who specialized in ancient texts and languages. The 19th century was the golden age of Orientalist scholarship, with major universities and museums investing heavily in the study of ancient civilizations. These scholars had the linguistic skills and comparative resources needed to translate difficult texts and place them in historical context. The process of translation would have involved multiple experts. First, linguists would have worked to identify and translate the various languages and dialects present in the text. Then historians would have attempted to verify the claims made in the manuscript by comparing them with other known sources. Archaeologists might have been consulted to determine whether the physical descriptions in the text matched known sites and monuments. This collaborative approach was standard for important manuscript discoveries, and it makes the scroll's destruction all the more significant. The fire didn't just eliminate a single document, it destroyed the opportunity for the entire European scholarly establishment to examine and analyze what might have been the most important historical text ever discovered. But before any translations were completed, tragedy struck. Accounts vary, and this variation itself is suspicious. Some say it was a fire in his private study, others say it was the archive building, where the manuscripts were being stored, possibly in Vienna, possibly in Lyon. The uncertainty about basic facts suggests that details about the incident were deliberately obscured or that witnesses were discouraged from providing clear accounts. The result was the same regardless of the specific location or cause. The scroll, along with much of the man's private collection, was lost in flames. What makes this particularly tragic is that 19th century scholars typically made multiple copies of important texts, precisely because they understood how easily manuscripts could be lost. The fact that no copies, photographs, or even detailed notes survived suggests either extraordinary carelessness or deliberate destruction. The only surviving reference is a single, second-hand letter, probably written by someone who had heard about the scroll but never seen it directly. This letter quotes the monk's line about the Nile that flowed differently, but provides no other details about the text's contents. The scarcity of documentation is itself evidence of how thoroughly the scroll's existence was erased from the historical record. Historians who dismiss the story say it was probably a misunderstanding that the scroll, if it existed, might have been a late Gnostic invention, a symbolic retelling of Egypt's mythic past. They point out that many 19th century collectors were duped by fake relics sold by locals who understood what Europeans wanted to hear. But this explanation feels more like containment than correction, because if the scroll really did reference the pyramids as pre-linguistic, pre-dynastic structures, if it really did describe a civilization that sealed knowledge in stone before the rise of kings, then it would reframe every assumption we have about Egyptian history, not as a wild theory, but as a record someone failed to erase in time. And once it was discovered, it didn't need to be disproved, it just needed to be gone. This wasn't the first time something like this happened, and the pattern becomes more disturbing when you examine it closely. In the 1700s, French scholars reported hearing about a temple inscription near Aswan that listed kings predating Menes, the so-called first king of unified Egypt. The inscription, if it existed, would have extended Egyptian chronology back thousands of years beyond the accepted timeline, but the wall collapsed in an earthquake, the rubbings were lost, and the site was never excavated again. The timing of these accidents is remarkable. Archaeological discoveries that threaten established timelines seem particularly prone to natural disasters, fires, and other mishaps that conveniently eliminate evidence before it can be properly studied. In the early 20th century, a German linguist claimed to have translated part of a Nubian papyrus that referred to stones of resonance west of the Nile, but he died during World War I and his notes were scattered. Each incident, taken individually, seems like simple misfortune. But when viewed as a pattern, they suggest something more systematic. It's as if there's an invisible hand working to ensure that certain types of evidence never survive long enough to challenge the established narrative of human history. But there's a difference between decay and deletion. When stories are lost to time, they leave fragments, traces in other texts, partial translations, copies made by scribes who didn't understand what they were preserving. When stories are removed on purpose, they leave nothing. That's what makes the Coptic scroll so haunting. It didn't fade, it didn't weather away over centuries, it burned. At exactly the moment it might have been translated, at exactly the moment it might have said too much. It's easy to blame fire, libraries burn, accidents happen, paper is fragile. But this wasn't just any paper, it was a scroll that described the pyramids as older than the kings who claimed them, older than Egypt, older than words. And for that kind of story, accident begins to feel like design, because if even a single scroll could break the spell, the illusion that we understand how it all began, then maybe silence is the safest archive. Not because it preserves, but because it protects us from remembering something we were never supposed to know. Maybe that's what sealed in stone really means, not buried to preserve, but buried to prevent. A knowledge that isn't forbidden by power, but by time itself. And every once in a while something leaks through, a scroll, a stele, a chamber, but always just enough to feel incomplete. The destruction of texts that challenge established narratives isn't unique to Egypt. Throughout history, libraries have burned, archives have disappeared, and manuscripts have vanished at precisely the moments when they might have provided inconvenient truths. The pattern suggests something more systematic than random misfortune. The Great Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but there are countless others. The Library of Baghdad during the Mongol invasion, the Maya codices burned by Spanish conquistadors, the Irish manuscripts destroyed during Viking raids. Each time, irreplaceable knowledge vanished, leaving gaps in our understanding that may never be filled. But the Coptic scroll is different because it wasn't destroyed during a war or invasion. It disappeared during peacetime in the hands of a collector who had every reason to preserve it. The fire that consumed it seems almost too convenient, too perfectly timed to be accidental. And if the scroll's destruction was deliberate, it raises questions about who had the power to orchestrate such a thing and why they would consider a single ancient text dangerous enough to eliminate. What knowledge could have been so threatening that it couldn't be allowed to survive even in a European archive, far from Egypt and its political concerns? The monk's description of the pyramids being built before language is particularly intriguing. If taken literally, it would place their construction in a period before organized human speech, which would make them older than any civilization we know about. But it might also be metaphorical, referring to a time before written language, before the development of the symbolic systems that would eventually become hieroglyphs. Either interpretation challenges the established timeline. If the pyramids predate written language, they belong to a completely different chapter of human development than anything we've previously understood. They would represent achievements by people who left no written records, no named rulers, no cultural artifacts beyond the monuments themselves. That kind of discovery wouldn't just change Egyptology, it would change archaeology, anthropology, and our entire understanding of how human civilization developed. It would suggest that sophisticated architectural knowledge existed thousands of years before we thought it did, and that this knowledge was somehow transmitted across vast periods of time without leaving traces in the archaeological record. Maybe that's why the scroll had to burn, not because it was false, but because it was true, because it contained information that would have forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the past, and there were people who understood that some truths are too dangerous to preserve. It was built with no inscription, but every measurement is a message. The Great Pyramid of Giza is silent in every traditional way. No prayers on the walls, no scenes of gods, no royal cartouche. But its dimensions are not random. They follow ratios, not just pleasing ones, but precise ones. Ratios that echo through astronomy, geometry, and planetary physics. Ratios that Egypt, as we know it, should not have known, unless someone did. And they encoded it in stone. Start with the basics, though in this case, basic means measurements so precise they challenge everything we think we know about ancient capabilities. Each side of the Great Pyramid's base measures approximately 230.4 meters, but this approximation hides remarkable precision. When surveyed with modern instruments, the base sides vary by no more than 2 centimeters across the entire length, a tolerance that would be impressive in contemporary construction. The original height was 146.6 meters, though this requires some calculation since the pyramidion, the capstone that once crowned the structure, has been lost for centuries. But when you divide the perimeter by the height, you get 2 pi, not approximately, not vaguely, a near-perfect match to the circle constant, encoded in a square base and a pointed summit. The mathematical precision becomes even more striking when examined in detail. The perimeter of the base is 921.6 meters. The height is 146.6 meters. Divide 921.6 by 146.6. and you get 6.2857, which is 2 pi to within 0.1%. This isn't the kind of approximation you get from trial and error. This is the result of deliberate calculation using knowledge of mathematical constants that weren't supposed to exist in ancient Egypt. Some dismiss it as coincidence, but the mathematical relationships multiply when examined closely. The slope of the pyramid, about 51.84 degrees, also encodes the golden ratio when you compare the half-base length to the height. Pi in the perimeter, phi in the slope, and both encoded simultaneously in a single structure. The probability of this happening by accident approaches 0. It goes further, extending from mathematical abstractions into physical constants that describe our planet itself. Multiply the pyramid's height by 43,200 and you get 6,356,400 meters, which matches Earth's polar radius to within 99.7% accuracy. Multiply the base perimeter by the same number and you get 39,931,200 meters, which approximates Earth's equatorial circumference with similar precision. Why 43,200? It's not arbitrary. It's a factor tied to the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle in Earth's axial wobble that was supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. This precession causes the apparent position of stars to shift slowly over centuries, a phenomenon that requires sophisticated astronomical observation to detect and measure. 43,200 is precisely 1/600th of 25,920, a scaling constant that brings celestial and terrestrial measurements into proportion. But this raises profound questions about the builders' knowledge. How could they have known about precession, which requires centuries of careful observation to detect? How could they have calculated Earth's dimensions without the ability to measure latitude and longitude, without understanding the planet's spherical shape, without having any of the mathematical tools that such calculations would require? The astronomical knowledge gets even more specific. The internal shafts in the pyramid point to specific stars with remarkable precision. The southern shaft in the King's Chamber aligns with Orion's belt, while the northern shaft points to the pole star. But not just any position of these constellations, their position around 2450 BCE, which matches the traditional dating of the pyramid's construction, except that the alignment is too perfect for the technology supposedly available at the time. Achieving such precision would require instruments capable of measuring fractions of degrees, knowledge of stellar motion that wouldn't be developed for thousands of years, and mathematical techniques for calculating complex three-dimensional relationships between Earth's surface and distant stars. How could builders 4,500 years ago have known Earth's curvature, axial tilt, or the golden ratio? The conventional explanation is that they didn't have this knowledge explicitly, but somehow achieved these results through intuitive design and practical experience. But this explanation becomes less convincing when you examine the precision involved. They didn't have the instruments for such measurements. No evidence exists of the mathematical techniques required for such calculations. No records survive of the centuries of accumulated knowledge that such precision would have required. The ancient Egyptians are credited with practical mathematics focused on construction and commerce, but nothing in the historical record suggests they understood advanced geometry, astronomical cycles, or planetary physics. Yet the alignment is so exact that the pyramid is oriented within 0.05 degrees of true north, a precision that modern builders struggle to match even with sophisticated surveying equipment, satellite navigation, and computer-controlled construction tools. The base is leveled to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire area, despite being built on a natural limestone plateau that required extensive leveling and preparation. The construction techniques required to achieve this precision remain mysterious. Moving and positioning blocks weighing up to 15 tons with millimeter accuracy would be challenging with modern equipment. Doing it with ropes, ramps, and copper tools borders on the impossible. Yet the evidence is there in the stone itself, undeniable and unexplained. Egyptologists call it intuitive genius, suggesting that ancient surveyors used ropes, stars, and water levels to achieve results through trial and error refined across generations. They point to the ingenuity of Egyptian engineers, their mastery of practical mathematics, their sophisticated understanding of construction techniques developed over centuries of pyramid building. But that explanation falters under the weight of consistency and precision because other pyramids, even those built just decades later by the same culture using the same techniques, do not replicate these ratios. The Pyramid of Khafre, built perhaps 20 years after the Great Pyramid, shows none of the same mathematical precision. Its alignments are sloppier, its geometry less refined, its astronomical orientations approximate rather than exact. The Pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the three at Giza, abandons the mathematical relationships entirely. Later pyramids show steady degradation in both construction quality and mathematical sophistication. If the Great Pyramid represented the culmination of gradually developed knowledge, we would expect to see that knowledge preserved and improved upon in subsequent constructions. Instead, the mathematical codes disappear. The precision vanishes, the astronomical alignments become approximate, which means the Great Pyramid wasn't part of a learning curve or the result of gradually accumulated expertise. It was a singularity, a spike in precision that appeared fully formed and was never successfully repeated. This pattern suggests that the knowledge embodied in the Great Pyramid wasn't developed by the civilization that built it. It was preserved by them, transmitted from some earlier source, and then lost again when the original understanding disappeared. The pyramid becomes not an achievement of 4th dynasty Egypt, but a repository of much older knowledge that was briefly accessible and then forgotten. Some theorists suggest the pyramid is a kind of mathematical time capsule, a structure designed to preserve constants and values that do not decay with language or culture. This interpretation views the monument not as a tomb or temple, but as a form of information storage that could survive the collapse of civilizations. Words fade, languages die, writing systems become unreadable. But pi remains pi regardless of who discovers it or when. Mathematical constants are universal, independent of culture, politics, or historical period. Ratios survive even when the knowledge of how to calculate them is lost. If you want to communicate across millennia, you don't use ink on papyrus or inscriptions on stone, you use geometry and scale. By encoding universal numbers in the pyramid's dimensions, the builders may have been anchoring knowledge they feared would be lost. Not to time in the ordinary sense, but to catastrophe, to civilizational collapse, to the kinds of forgetting that erase entire cultures from the historical record. The pyramid becomes not a monument to death, but a monument to continuity, not a tomb, not a temple, but a reset point, a place where a recovering civilization might once again remember how the sky moves, how the earth turns, what the structure of reality feels like when expressed in mass and light. The mathematical relationships encoded in the structure are like a curriculum waiting to be discovered, a course in advanced mathematics and astronomy that could jumpstart scientific understanding in a society that had forgotten these principles. This interpretation explains why the pyramid contains no inscriptions, no religious imagery, no cultural markers that would tie it to a specific time and place. Such elements would make the structure less universal, more dependent on linguistic and cultural knowledge that might not survive. But mathematical relationships transcend culture. They can be discovered independently by any civilization that develops sufficient mathematical sophistication to recognize them. We think of monuments as commemorations, built to honor the past, to name the builder, to fix glory in place. But what if this wasn't for the past or even the present? What if it was built for the future, not to impress, but to warn? A structure encoded with the proportions of the earth, anchored to true north, sealed in silence, and waiting to be noticed again. Not by priests, not by kings, but by someone with tools and questions, because geometry doesn't forget. And if the world had to begin again, this is the shape that would still be standing, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. Maybe that's why no name is written inside, because names don't matter when you're building for extinction. Names are cultural artifacts tied to specific languages, specific historical periods, specific societies. But mathematical constants are eternal. Pi will be the same ratio, whether discovered by ancient Egyptians, medieval Islamic mathematicians, or future civilizations we can't imagine. Only ratios matter, only recurrence, only scale. And maybe that's how you build for catastrophe, not with culture, which is fragile and temporary, but with constants, which are universal and permanent. The pyramid doesn't teach in the way we understand teaching. It doesn't preach or proclaim or explain. It simply holds, preserving in its proportions the fundamental relationships that govern physical reality. Not truth in the abstract philosophical sense, but the scaffolding that truth needs to return. the mathematical framework that any advanced civilization must rediscover if it wants to understand the cosmos. The pyramid becomes a silent professor, waiting with infinite patience for students who may not arrive for thousands of years. This is knowledge storage of the most sophisticated kind, not dependent on language which changes or writing systems which become obsolete or cultural traditions which can be forgotten. The knowledge is encoded in stone, in measurements, in relationships that will remain true as long as the structure survives. It's a form of information preservation that could outlast any conceivable civilizational collapse, and maybe that's the real purpose. Not to glorify a pharaoh who's been forgotten anyway, but to preserve knowledge for a future that might desperately need it. A civilization that had discovered advanced mathematics and astronomy, faced some kind of catastrophe, and built the pyramid as a way to ensure that crucial knowledge wouldn't be permanently lost. The deeper we dug, the quieter it became. What began as a simple question about who built the pyramids led us through a labyrinth of contradictions that refused to resolve into comfortable answers. We found monuments without builders, tombs without bodies, messages without words. We discovered evidence that challenged timelines, institutional responses that buried discoveries, and patterns of forgetting that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. We were told to look for Khufu, to find his tools and ramps and royal plans. We were told the pyramids were tombs, symbols of power and kingship and eternal glory. But every piece of evidence we examined pointed in a different direction. The inventory. Stela suggested Khufu restored rather than built. The dream stela revealed systematic forgetting across dynasties. The missing tomb showed a pharaoh who vanished from his own monument. Water erosion that shouldn't exist. Robotic discoveries that were quickly sealed. Underground chambers that authorities deny despite photographic evidence. Scrolls that burned before translation, mathematical precision that exceeds what any ancient civilization should have possessed. What if the pyramids were never meant to honor the past? What if they were built to outlast the future? Everything the pyramids don't say has become louder than what we were taught to believe. They don't say who built them, they don't say why, they don't even say when. They just stand aligned to stars, measured to Earth's dimensions, balanced in silence like someone built them to survive not just empires but forgetting itself. The pattern emerges not from what we found, but from what was systematically hidden. Workers who never learned the word for refusal, transport logs that avoid mentioning purpose, institutional silence around underground discoveries, ancient texts that disappear at crucial moments, modern authorities who seal doors the moment they're opened. This isn't random. This is the architecture of a mission, a world carefully curated to leave just enough clues to be confusing but never enough to remember clearly. Because memory can be destroyed through violence, but doubt can be maintained forever through careful management of information. The pyramid builders may have understood something we're only beginning to grasp, that the most sophisticated forms of preservation don't depend on language, culture, or political systems. They depend on encoding knowledge in forms that transcend human institutions, mathematical relationships that remain true regardless of who discovers them, astronomical alignments that will be accurate for thousands of years, geometric proportions that speak to any civilization advanced enough to measure them precisely. We asked who built the pyramids, expecting to find a name, a dynasty, a historical period we could file away in textbooks. Instead, we found something more disturbing, evidence of knowledge that was already ancient when the pharaohs arrived to claim it, systematically concealed by institutions that seem to understand its implications better than they're willing to admit. Perhaps the pyramids were never built to glorify anyone. Perhaps they were built to warn future civilizations about the fragility of knowledge, about how easily advanced understanding can be lost, about how important it is to preserve crucial information in forms that can survive the collapse of the societies that created them, or perhaps they were built to wait, to serve as a test for any civilization sophisticated enough to recognize what they actually represent. The sealed doors, the missing inscriptions, the mathematical precision, the institutional concealment all become part of a larger mechanism designed to separate those who are ready for certain knowledge from those who aren't. The most unsettling possibility is that they were built to be found by us after everything else had already been lost. That we're not the first advanced civilization to wonder about their purpose, and that the knowledge they preserve is knowledge we once possessed and somehow forgot. The pyramids become not monuments to an ancient past, but reminders of a cyclical pattern in which advanced knowledge appears, gets lost, and has to be rediscovered by societies that have no memory of ever having it before. In the end, we're not left with a name or a simple answer. We're left with a shape that doesn't fit into our models of human development, doesn't fade despite our attempts to explain it away, and doesn't stop raising questions no matter how many doors get sealed or how many scrolls disappear. The Great Pyramid stands as proof that someone, somewhere, once possessed knowledge sophisticated enough to encode the mathematical relationships governing our planet in a monument designed to last for geological time. Whether that someone was the ancient Egyptians, some earlier civilization, or something else entirely, the structure itself remembers even when we don't. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the pyramid was never meant to provide answers, but to ensure that the right questions never stop being asked. To serve as a permanent reminder that human knowledge is not as linear or as permanent as we like to believe, and that the most important truths might be the ones we've forgotten how to see. The shape that memory forgot is still there, waiting with the patience of stone for the next civilization, curious enough to measure it carefully and brave enough to admit what those measurements might mean.